All right, Jessica, Emil Bovy, I want to go into this discussion that we're having right now. Emil Bovy, who is a former SDNY prosecutor, but he is now on the Trump legal team, is saying we're not able to elicit testimony that would impeach some of the hearsay that's been offered. This form of impeachment that he entered a settlement agreement, we don't think it's relevant. Talking about this settlement agreement with Allen Weisselberg. Then they have more discussions about Weisselberg. We're looking to explain from our perspective why he isn't here. There are 3 payments due to Weisselberg in a calendar year. If you look at the agreement, the employee promises not to denigrate the company verbally or in writing or in any of its entities. Conroy says he will not communicate with or cooperate with any entity, anyone with adverse claims, or to take action to cause any person or entity to file a complaint or a lawsuit of any kind. The bottom line is, and this goes to what Emil Bovy, again on Trump's team, is saying, this agreement is not why Weisselberg is not at this trial. Nobody tried to invoke that agreement. How important is it to be able to enter things about Weisselberg, who was the CFO of Trump Org, but not have him testify?
Yeah, this is a really intriguing development in the case, is sort of the focus on Weisselberg, why he's not there, and whether any party is going to be able to talk about that and try to offer an explanation to the jury. Because it does look like one avenue that the Trump defense team may be exploring is blaming Weisselberg and Cohen, and essentially saying that Trump had nothing to do with the agreement about how to reimburse Cohen and how to record it in the records of the Trump organization. If they can just leave that possibility there for the jury, that could create reasonable doubt. And if an explanation is offered that's beneficial to the prosecution for why precisely Weisselberg is not here testifying, then that obviously would help the prosecution. If, in fact, the prosecution is able to say, look, the reason he's not here is because essentially Trump paid him to not offer testimony that was bad for Trump, well, then you can make an inference effectively that he was doing this at Trump's behest, and he would say nothing that would be helpful to Trump.
I want to go back into the document, Chuck, for a minute. Steinglass, who's lead prosecutor, says, while it is true we could subpoena him, meaning Weisselberg, the agreement precludes us from talking to him against the backdrop of what Jessica just laid out. How important is this decision from Judge Juan Merchan?
Remarkable, Chris, that the CFO, right, the guy who handled the paper and who talked to Cohen and who talked to Trump and who ostensibly would know about the deal, isn't testifying in a criminal trial. And, Jessica had it exactly right. An important development. It's a bit mysterious, but it's hard for me to imagine as a prosecutor that I wouldn't want that guy on the stand. So it's really interesting to see how the judge handles this problem. My inclination as a prosecutor would be to try and force the issue, to subpoena Weisselberg and put him on the stand and see what happens. But he's not cooperating, and he has, it seems, several million reasons not to. It's not a problem that should have surprised anyone. It was apparent, I think, from the outset that Weisselberg wouldn't cooperate, didn't want to. But, federal prosecutors like Jessica, state prosecutors like the folks trying this case, have ways to force the issue. Maybe less in state court than in federal court. But it's a little surprising and a little disappointing that a witness potentially as important as Weisselberg may not testify.
Well, here we go. We're back into this. And Mr. Weisselberg, says Emil Bovy, again, for the defense, has never been on the government witness list. And then to try to get around it and try to add him to the witness list, they're obviously not happy about that. Juan Merchan says, I don't see how one thing has to do with the other. This is done with some frequency. The only way to know is to put him on the stand without the jury under oath. Emil Bovy, we were entitled to notice of that long before the trial started. Merchan asks, you didn't think that was a possibility? Not based on the witness list, no. But what is the truth here in a trial about witnesses coming in that maybe weren't on the original witness list?
Yeah, there's no rule that says you can't call a witness who hasn't previously been on the witness list. If there's some prejudice to the other side of sort of the late notice, then the judge might say, well, I'm going to give you a slight delay so that you can prepare for this if this is necessary. But you know, it's been pretty clear to everybody involved that Alan Weisselberg was a critical figure in this whole story. I mean, part of the reason why, at least it's been reported, that prosecutors have repeatedly charged Weisselberg was in part because they were trying to get his cooperation, and he's just resisted that again and again. So they've clearly been interested in his testimony for some time, and he was put on the stand in the Trump Organization trial. So he has been a witness before. I think that the issue here is what happens if, in fact, he's put on the stand. He may well invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. I mean, he's already in prison, but that doesn't mean he couldn't potentially have exposure for other crimes, or it could increase his sentence depending on what he says. So that's why I think the judge is saying we would do this without the jury being present, so that if, in fact, he's going to invoke the Fifth, that wouldn't happen in front of the jury.
So Donald Trump is walking out right now. Let's just listen briefly to hear what he has to say.
Amazing, actually. It was amazing. Everybody can say whatever they want. They can say whatever they want, but I'm not allowed to say anything about anybody. It's a disgrace, and you see it. The media sees it, and it's really very sad. If you look at the legal experts and the legal scholars, every one of them say this trial is a scam. It's something that should have never happened. By the way, it could have happened 7 years ago. They bring it right during the election. Nobody sees that. Nobody talks.
So this is a frequent complaint of Donald Trump that the trial is a scam. He blames it on people, that all of those things are completely untrue. Having said that, what he did say at the beginning does speak to what happened in court right before he came out. And that is the whole issue, Vaughn Hilliard, of Michael Cohen, who is expected to take the stand, as we said, on Monday, and the whole idea of the gag order. So Todd Blanche, who, as you know, is the lead defense attorney, said, with respect to Mr. Cohen, stating the obvious regarding the gag order, Mr. Cohen continues to speak publicly about this trial and about Mr. Trump wearing a white shirt with President Trump behind bars. We request that he be prohibited from talking the same way Mr. Trump is, not only stop extrajudicial statements from lawyers, but witnesses as well. We request Cohen be prohibited, again, from talking the way Trump is now, and there's a week left in this trial. This gets to the heart of what has frustrated Donald Trump, right, Vaughn, about the fact that he feels for a long time Stormy Daniels could say what she wanted, Michael Cohen could say what he wanted and make money off of it with his TikTok lives, but Donald Trump, under the gag order, is not able to respond.
Right, and this is exactly what we heard from Todd Blanche yesterday after court ended for the day. But it was about Stormy Daniels specifically, that they wanted and believed that now that Stormy Daniels was off the stand, that Donald Trump should be able to respond in kind to her. And noting that there are voters and reporters that are asking him questions about the case, and that he should have the right to respond to Stormy Daniels' public statements. There was a new one yesterday when she put on X, quote, real men respond to testimony by being sworn in and taking the stand in court. Oh, wait, never mind. Those were the words of Stormy Daniels, essentially making a call to Donald Trump. OK, if you want to talk about me, then go and testify under oath, just like I did in this court. But now you're seeing with Michael Cohen, the attorney for Donald Trump, also making the case that he should be able to respond to Michael Cohen. 2 weeks ago, Cohen had posted on his social media account that he would stop publicly talking about the case, but he has maybe limited a little bit more, but he has not wholly stopped from talking about this case. And now Donald Trump's attorney, clearly on the behest of his client, wants to be able to respond to their public attacks of what they say are attacks against him.
And one of the things we learned in reading your books, Phil, and just observing Donald Trump is that his mood and how he feels about the way he's being treated can often have a great impact on the way he treats the people around him. It can also have a great impact on how he tweets, what he says now, for example, when he comes out of court. And I'm wondering what you're reading into what you're seeing and hearing from him and the level of frustration he has about this.
Well, Chris, that's exactly right, that his mood dictates how he behaves. It also dictated while he was president how he acted, the policy decisions that he made as president. But what we've seen the last few days, especially in this week of trial, is a lot of anger coming from former President Trump. And you see that in the comments he was just making a couple minutes ago, this feeling that he's not being permitted by this judge to speak his mind, to say what he wants to say in a way that some of the witnesses have been. Obviously, this has been a tense subject of much debate throughout this trial from the beginning with this gag order, and something that Trump has really pushed back against, both in his social media posts but also in the pleas from his defense attorneys. But I assume this is a line we're going to continue to hear from Trump as he uses it to really try to make the point to his political supporters that somehow this trial is rigged against him, that this is unfair, that the judge is not treating him fairly, that he is being persecuted by the criminal justice system. That's the argument Trump's making. It's not backed up by evidence, of course, but when you see this frustration and this anger from Trump, it all feeds into that broader narrative that he's trying to portray in front of his political supporters.
But do you also see, Phil, over the last couple of days, a kind of restraint? He does have that threat of jail hanging over him, the possibility, if not likelihood, that he could go and join Allen Weisselberg at Rikers. He has not made statements that were so directly inflammatory, potentially, as others he has made in the past. Do you think that Judge Juan Merchan's gag order and threat of jail is now, at least now, working?
Well, that is what's changed this week. The threat of jail became a possibility that the judge laid out earlier this week, and Trump has been slightly more restrained than he was earlier in the trial, and certainly than he was in the run-up to the trial. We're still seeing these flashes of anger and frustration, but you're right. We're not seeing the same kind of inflammatory and directly personal attacks and commentary that we're used to seeing from Trump, almost certainly because of that threat of jail time, which is absolutely the last place where Donald Trump would like to see himself end up.